Hey, I'm Matt Manning. Thanks so much for joining me for this session number 1 as we study the names of God, that God is for you. If you didn't get a chance, I hope that you would take some time and read the introductory session there in your study guide as we talk about what happens when you can't see the obvious. I share a quick story in there about baking some things and talking about birthday celebrations. And so I'd encourage you to take a minute, pause the video, and read through that. And then I'd encourage you also with your group, if you have not read through it yet, read through the scripture to read on page 27 that talks about the background of this story of Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar, to be able to better understand this story. I'll mention an overview of it briefly, then we'll go ahead and jump into this study as we look at this idea that God sees you. Overarching this study is really to help you take those doubts that we have. And what's amazing is those doubts that we have will come through in each of these 6 sessions as we see God interacts with people very specifically. Most often it's individuals, but then we'll see sometimes it's whole groups of people where God reveals himself in a powerful and amazing way. And each time the response or result of that interaction with God is a deeper trust and faith in God. And then from that comes a naming of God, to have a greater connection, to say this experience, I want to symbolically use a name for God to be able to remember this. And so each time it's amazing how the people in these stories respond to what God has done for them and in and through their lives and situations, to be able to say, this is who God is to me. For this first story, it's a really amazing and crazy and dysfunctional story. If you think your family or you're going through a situation is dysfunctional, this is an extremely dysfunctional situation. What we have here in this story of Abraham and Sarah and Hagar is not how can I put it? It's not a story where we want to use it as an example to follow. But what amazes me about this story is that it's really a revelation that God is faithful, regardless of how we don't depend on God, regardless of how we doubt God, and regardless of our choices many times, that God proves himself that he is faithful even when we are very unfaithful. To give you a quick recap on the story, we have the age-old Bible story, if you will, of Abraham and Sarah. You probably, if you've been around church for any length of time, grew up in Sunday school, you've heard this story of Abraham and Sarah and God promising them a son. Abraham's original given name was Abram, which is a father. And when people would see him and say, hey, what's your name? And he'd say, my name is Abram. And they'd say, well, how many kids do you have? Your name means father. And he'd say, well, I have no kids. And so it kind of was almost an irony of his name. But God comes along in Genesis chapter 12 and promises to Abraham and Sarah that he will make Abraham a father of many great nations. And so from that point on, we have this promise, especially in Abraham's older years. And part of the challenge of this problem was that Abraham and Sarah were beyond childbearing years. And so at one point they said it's basically God's not coming through on his promise. Sarah wasn't able to have kids, and so Sarah says, let's go ahead and just take matters into our own hands. And she says, here, why don't you go ahead and try to have a child with my handmaid or my servant, my assistant, if you will, my personal assistant, Hagar. And so Abraham spends time with Hagar, and she gets pregnant, and this pregnancy becomes a massive issue as you've read through the passage, where Hagar begins to mistreat Sarah because now she is able to have a child by Abraham. And in response, Sarah begins to mistreat Hagar terribly. And Hagar, while she's pregnant, she hasn't even had the child yet, she runs off and she leaves Abraham and Sarah, and she goes off into the wilderness to kind of defend for herself. So you can imagine the treatment that Hagar must have gone through was so terrible that she would leave. Now, if you've ever been in a situation where it's toxic, an environment where you feel disrespected or mistreated, where it's dysfunctional and you feel like I want to run, whether it's a job situation or a relationship, maybe a friendship, maybe an environment situation, maybe a home living situation, and you say it's just not healthy for me to be here anymore, you can greatly empathize with Hagar. Now, We don't know, was Hagar complicit? Was she forced into this situation? We don't know. It was very much of a messed up situation, to say the least. But what we do know is that she cries out to God. And so if you take a look there in your handouts, in your study guides on page 28, the video outline, we're going to take a look at this. We've got the big problem and the big question and then the big idea. This name of God that we'll see is El Roi, the God who sees. And we'll see this is Genesis 16:13 is where we pull this name of God from. You are the God who sees is a quote from Hagar. Well, see, the big problem is this. What do you do when life throws immense challenges at us that we didn't expect? You figure for Hagar, she had been told by Sarah, hey, this is okay. She got the green light to be a surrogate, if you will, for Sarah. And so everything's fine. And then all of a sudden it's, wait. No, it's a take back. And so all of a sudden now Hagar finds herself in this situation that, well, what do I do? And it becomes heated enough that she says, I've got to leave. And so we've all been through situations that we didn't expect. Maybe a job that we got into that turned sour, a relationship that turned sour, that didn't go well. And then the question comes, how do we handle difficult consequences that we didn't choose? I talked to our small group several weeks back, and I said, as a pastor, one of the most challenging conversations I have in counseling and trying to encourage people, one is when somebody comes and says, hey, I've blown it, I've sinned, I've messed up, and now I'm dealing with the consequences of that sin. And that's one type of conversation. That's difficult to have. It's also difficult to have a situation where somebody says, hey, I'm dealing with difficult challenges in life, and I haven't done anything wrong, but it's just maybe it's persecution, like Jesus talked about in the Sermon on the Mount, like Peter talks about that there are fiery trials. James says, don't be surprised and count it all joy when you fall into difficult situations. What's really challenging is a third type of conversation I have with people when they say, Pastor Matt, I am dealing with the consequences of somebody else's choices. I'm dealing with the consequences of somebody else's sin. And I didn't do anything, and here I am holding the bag. What do I do? That's a really difficult conversation to have. And that's really part of the story as it plays out that Hagar is going through. So what's the big idea we're going to look at here? You can look there in your notes and fill in this blank. The big idea is this, that God sees you even in your loneliest situations. That God sees you even in your loneliest situations. The encouragement we're going to find through this is that there are 8 reasons not to give up. Hagar, she ran. She wanted to totally give up in the midst of the situation. But as we're going to find, things turn out for her good and for her betterment. And through this, she sees the goodness of God. Now, what's interesting to note, a little bit of backstory with all this, is we find that Hagar does have a son. Surprise, surprise, spoiler alert. And she names him Ishmael. And he is the father of the Palestinians. He is the father of basically the enemy of the Jews to this day. And Abraham and Sarah end up eventually having a child, and they name him Isaac, and you'll hear more about his story in session number 2. And Isaac is the father or the founder, the head of the nation of Israel. From him comes the nation of Israel. Because of this situation, because of this choice, we now have thousands of years later this massive conflict just because somebody didn't wait on God. And that's a whole other discussion and story. But for this session, we're going to look at, here are 8 reasons not to give up hope, as we'll see Hagar learns. Number 1 is this. You can jot down, God sees your most dysfunctional situation and cares about you. God sees your most dysfunctional situation and cares about you. We see here in Genesis chapter 16, verses 4 through 5. Look at what it says there. Abraham had sexual relations with Hagar, and she became pregnant. But when Hagar knew she was pregnant, she began to treat her mistress Sarah with contempt. Obviously, this very dysfunctional situation. Can you imagine being in Sarah's situation, in her shoes? She can't have children, and she comes up with this idea, hey, we're going to go ahead and have Abraham go ahead and try to see if we can get a surrogate here. And now there's contempt. And Sarai, and now before Abraham and Sarah, their names were changed. They were Abram and Sarai. Verse 5, then Sarai said to Abram, this is all your fault. So she begins to blame. Again, a dysfunctional situation. I put my servant into your arms, but now she's pregnant. She treats me with contempt. The Lord will show who's wrong, you or me. And so all of a sudden we find Hagar is now in the middle of this very toxic, very dysfunctional situation. And yet God sees her in the middle of this. And we'll see why here in just a minute. We see also number 2 is this. God sees you when you're disrespected. God sees you when you're disrespected. We see here in verse 6, Sarai treated Hagar so harshly that she finally ran away. Have you ever been in a situation where somebody treats you so poorly, you end up having to quit your job? You end up having to stop volunteering. You end up having to maybe leave a church situation or a friendship or a group of friends where it's just because it becomes so toxic. God sees you even in those moments when you feel disrespected. Maybe for you, you walk into work on Monday morning and the boss or that coworker who always knows how to push your buttons says just the right thing. And you think, man, doesn't anybody see this? Well, God sees it and God knows. We find then number 3 is this. God sees you in your desperation. God sees you in your desperation. Hagar is so desperate, we find here, that she runs away in the end of verse 6, where she feels so upset and so much turmoil inside that she actually takes action and she leaves. This may be for you in a situation where you're in a tough marriage situation where you have to separate and you have to leave physically being in the same room. Maybe it's these interactions you're having and you become so incensed and angry that you say, I just have to walk away in desperation before you say or do something you'll regret. And so even in those moments, God sees us and God knows what's happening. Number 4, God sees when you're deserted, when you feel like you're all alone. We look there in Genesis chapter 16, verses 7 and 8. We see that Hagar, she runs away into the wilderness. And it says there in verse 7, the angel of the Lord found Hagar beside a spring of water in the wilderness along the road to Shur. The angel said to her, Hagar, Sarai's servant, where have you come from and where are you going? I love throughout the scriptures, this is a whole different study. And sometime we should talk about how the questions of the scriptures, instead of coming and making an accusation and saying, listen, Hagar, you're dealing with the fallout of bad choices and decisions. The angel simply says, Hagar, what are you doing? Are you really going to be able to fend for yourself? Here you are. You don't have a job. You don't have a family. You're running in some direction towards Shur, and you find yourself, you're looking for hope and for help, but you're stuck here in the wilderness. You're sitting by a well. And what's interesting back in those days, that people would come to a well and they would come early in the morning to be able to get fresh water for the rest of the day, and then late at night, many times to get water to help them to get through the night. And so she's waiting for help, presumably, possibly, we don't know. But the angel says, what are you doing here? Why are you here? Where have you come from? And where are you going? We find the same question for us. When you're in a situation and you're tempted to run, it's easy for us to say, I've got to get out of here. But the question for us with God is this. Where are you going? What's your next step? Who are you depending on? Who are you trusting in? And we find then, it leads us to number 5. God sees you when you're discouraged and disoriented. She responds in verse 8. She says, I'm running away from my mistress Sarah. So she's leaving this situation. She's running away. She's disoriented. She's discouraged. She finds herself, we don't know how far along or how pregnant she was, but she has left what's familiar and she's gone to what's foreign to her. It's so bad in the familiar that she has to go someplace that she's not familiar with, that she is out and all alone and vulnerable, if you will. And so even in those times, God sees you when you feel like you're discouraged and when you're out of sorts. Number 6 on the next page, God hears your cry for help. God hears your cry for help. In verse 11, the angel says to Hagar, you are now pregnant and will give birth to a son, and you are to name him Ishmael, which means God hears, for the Lord has heard your cry of distress. That she cries out to God. And it's amazing in these moments, there are these pivotal moments, everybody has something that they're going through. My dad puts it this way. He says, son, everybody's jammed up. Everybody's got something they're struggling with. The challenge for us is when we interact with other individuals throughout our day, whether it's the clerk at the grocery store or the mail carrier or our coworkers or our neighbors or even our kids or friends or family, we always expect of them that they should be on the same page as us and they should live up to and beyond our expectations of them in any given moment. And the challenge for us is most often, nobody's ever on the same page, and nobody can ever live up to the expectations that you or I have for other people. It's almost impossible. We can't even live up to our own expectations. And so what we see here in this situation is that Hagar is crying out for help. She's saying, my situation is such a mess. I'm so discouraged. It's so dysfunctional. I feel deserted. I feel alone. I need your help, God. And so the angel says, here's the deal. God hears you. You're going to name your son that. What's amazing is this. Every time she calls Ishmael's name, from that point on, once he's born, eventually in the passage to come, we're going to read that he's born. Every time she says, come on, Ishmael, she thinks, God heard me. He heard my cry. We find that number 7 is this. We see God sees, hears, and provides when you call. God sees, hears, and provides when you call. This is where the name of God comes from, where Hagar gives the specific name and says, this is who God is to me. We see it says, the angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her authority. And in verse 10 it says, and then he added, I will give you more descendants than you can count. What's amazing is this. The same promise that God gave to Abraham, God now gives to Hagar. What is so amazing is this, is God was true to Abraham. And if Abraham would have followed through, and Abraham would have trusted God to bring about a son through Sarah, that, as we will see in the next session, that God gives him so many children and descendants, more than the stars of the sky and the sand of the sea, as he promised Abraham in Genesis 12. He gives that same promise to Hagar. And we say, but that's not how the story, that's not the ideal. And yet God even shows himself faithful even in the unideal situations. And so maybe for you right now, you're in a situation that is not ideal. Maybe you're in a divorce. Maybe you're going through this process and this is not ideal at all. Maybe your kids are struggling so badly and you're thinking, this is not what I pictured when I first cradled this little person in my arms, and now I've got a teenager who is maybe out of control and who I don't understand or recognize anymore of that sweet, tender-hearted little kid I once had. This is not ideal. Maybe you're in a job situation where when you signed on the dotted line and you filled out the paperwork, you thought, man, this is the picture-perfect, ideal job. This is my dream job. And now here you are 6 months later or 6 years later, and you find yourself, this is not at all what I pictured. Maybe you got into a car or a house or some kind of situation where you made a deal with somebody and it went sideways. It's not the ideal. And the question for us is, can God work even in unideal situations? And what we see here is yes. We can't give up because God can work when we cry out to him. We find then, last of all, number 8, God sees you. When God sees your grief, you can see his glory and his goodness, as Hagar is going to talk about. As we'll see, she calls out the name El Roi here in a moment. Look there in verse 13. Hagar used another name to refer to the Lord who had spoken to her. She said, you are the God who sees me. But then we go a step further and she also said, have I truly seen the one who sees me? And she says, in my situation, I have seen the one that God has looked upon me. He sees me. And she ends up going back and she has Ishmael, and she ends up, things continue to be rocky in her relationship with Abraham and with Sarah. And we find that Ishmael, he runs his mouth and they end up getting kicked out of the house anyway, and they have to go off. But God continues to even bless Ishmael in spite of the whole situation. But we find here she says, you are the God who sees. You are El Roi. And then she goes on and she says, but have I truly seen God? What I love about this is in these situations that we go through, we get an opportunity to experience and see God in deeper and greater ways. It's got to be something for you and for me where it's not just about riding on the coattails of what our parents experienced and our grandparents. It's not about riding on your coattails of that's what Matt, his experience with God has been. It's going to be trusting God in your unique, very specific situation where your back is up against the wall, where you have no other place to turn but to cry out to God and trust Him, to see beyond your doubts and say, against all hope, against all odds, against all doubts, I'm going to trust God. And that's what Hagar does. We see this last concluding thought for us is this: God sees and hears when you pray to Him. God sees and hears when you pray to Him. So the next time you're in a desperate, dysfunctional situation, pray to God. Seek God's face. As you look there in your notes, Job, an amazing, very difficult story to read, a very difficult book, a very poetic book to read. But at the end of all that he goes through, as you look there, we see this. He says, I had only heard about you before, but now I have seen you with my own eyes. It's one of those things, is seeing is believing, where we have to experience something for ourselves. And you know what? God wants you to experience His goodness and His grace in your life. But many times it's all on the other side of challenges and difficulty and dysfunctional situations. When we are so desperate, we cry out to God for His help. Hey, thanks so much for watching this session. I would encourage you to spend some time in your discussion questions, process and unpack these concepts and these points that we pulled from this session, and then as well take some time to pray for and encourage each other as maybe you share about some challenging situations you are going through yourselves, and get a time to really connect as a group together. Thanks so much for watching.